Hello everyone and welcome back to the next video in our OrCAD keyboard tutorial series. My name is Adam and in this video we are finally ready to start some placement for our board. Now what I have open here is actually the end goal of this video. This is going to be a little bit of a longer video because we have to place all of these keys in around the right location, and all of these diodes also need to get placed, correctly above each of their associated keys. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and just get started with the blank board and start placing all of components roughly, and then we'll start to fine-tune the placement once we start, assigning all of the correct footprints to our switches. So let's go ahead and dig in. So I will open my board file here. Now, in my second screen, usually what I like to do is to keep the schematic open so that I can reference it for placement on my board. The reason that's helpful is if you draw your schematic in an organized way, for example, like we drew the keys in our design, you will then be able to kind of use that as a reference of where those need to be placed on the layout. So for example, we have these columns and these rows, and then we want to be able to place those around the same way in our layout. So I'm going to move this over into my second monitor. So to place all of the components on our board, we can either use the ECO Quick Place Components, or we can just select all of these components here and using the placement command, place them, for example, in series or as a cluster. And let's go ahead and use vertical with a height of 6. That sounds fine. Select all the components in our design and just place them above the board. Alrighty. So as I said, once these are all placed, if for example I'm in the placement command, I click on one of these components. Now you can see that it is hovering over my mouse, and then I can place it where I want it to be on my keyboard. Now, one other thing that we did in the schematic, if you remember, is I talked about how all of the keys have alternate footprints defined for them. So if I go into my keys page 1 and I look at the shift key, we see that it has a width of 6.25U, which is kind of the measurement, I guess, standard for keyboard keys. I think 1U is a default key size, which is, kind of this box that I have drawn around each of these keys. All right, so if I go into my move command, I can see that each of these has a square drawn around it on the assembly layer, and I made sure that that square is exactly the 1U square size. So once we start placing these, and if I find my space key here, once we start placing these, we should see so switch 100. Let's see where switch 100. There it is. Once we start placing these, if we go into just our regular selection tool and click on the component, in the properties under footprint, we should have all of the different options for, what our key dimensions should be. So let me just re-import my PCB here. Yeah, you'll notice that I had to make a couple different changes really quickly because some of the switches didn't have the correct alternate footprint assigned. But if you just, continue with this board, you should have all the correct footprints assigned. So let's go to switch 100 again. Yep. And here's 6.25U. So if we click that alternate footprint, you can see that the spacebar actually has that full length, which we are expecting. Let's go ahead and bring it back to just 1U, because what we want to do is just start kind of roughly laying these out around our board. One other thing is, if I remember correctly, the general size for each of these switches is around, it's not exactly 1 inch, but if we go into our grids, it's 1, 2, 3. So 750, so 3/4 of an inch maybe. Yeah, looks to be about 3/4 of an inch. So if we set our grid to 375, so if we try to place it, you'll see now that it kind of gets centered where it should be sitting on the board. However, I believe that these actually need to be slightly, offset from that point. So let me just double check in my last board where the corner component was placed. So let's save this and go into my placement done. And this component is placed at 500, 500. Okay, so we'll use that as a reference for the first key and then place the rest of these keys accordingly. All right, so I will use the schematic as a reference and go all the way to my column 0 and rows 1 through 5. I can select each of these switches and start to place them using the placement command. And I will use the cluster vertical, and there are 6 components, so these should cluster as 6 components. Let me just select them again with the active command. So there we go. These are clustered as 6 components, and I can just kind of roughly place them around here. And I can go to the next column, again, roughly place them. Next column. Actually, we should be able to theoretically select 2 columns at a time because we have this height set to 6. Let's go ahead and place them. Now, some of these columns only have 5 rows, for example, again, because our spacebar is going to be pretty wide and take up more than 1 column in some cases. And some of the other keys like the enter key, the tab key, backspace, those are also wider on a normal keyboard. There we go. And you don't have to be super neat at this point. Just see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, column 8, no. Again, just get a rough placement so that you know around where things need to be placed, and then we will adjust it as we need. And don't worry about the diodes at this point. Once we have all of the keys placed correctly, we'll actually place the diodes just above each of the keys. And that's pretty easy to do because we'll always have these little indicators for, where it needs to be placed or above which component it needs to be placed. So go over to the keys 2 page and just keep on placing these little key clusters on our design. All right, perfect. So we have now all of the keys placed on our design. And let me just turn off all of the connections so it's a little easier to see. All of these diodes, again, we're going to place those later. However, the LCD we are planning on having in the top right corner here. So let's go ahead and place it right around here. Okay. Let's turn off snapping. Copy. Not sure why that's happening. Let's just use the move command. Turn all of that off. There we go. So right around here. And then all of the components associated with the LCD, the controller, those will go underneath it. So again, I can select those on my schematic. Placement command. Again, I'll select some of these LCD components. Oops, not the LCD itself. Let's cancel that. There we go. I'll just place these under the LCD for now. We'll go to the controller, place all of these under the LCD as well. And what else do we have here? This is U3, that's the power regulator. We will have our USB connector. Okay. All right, there we go. So our USB connector, caps, etc., go right there. And then we will have these LEDs. These will get placed in this top row over here. Just go to the LEDs page. And again, let's just start with a rough placement. Select all these components. And actually want it to be horizontal now. Or you know what, we can do vertical and set this to 2 components. Okay. The mounting holes, where you place these at this point really doesn't matter too much. I'll just place them roughly around where we might want mounting holes in our design. But this should more depend on, how you plan on maybe creating an enclosure for your design. So mounting holes, maybe that's also dictated by like a mechanical engineer that you're working with. Just rough for now. Okay, so let's actually start placing the switches where they should be going. I'll go to my keys page. And if I start to look at some of these keys, I know that certain keys like the tab key, the caps lock key, the shift key, they are not exactly 1U in dimension. So if I look at tab, this one right here, and go to properties, I actually want to change this to a 1.5U. And if I turn on my assembly layers, I can see this outline here, which is telling me, well, this key actually needs to be, it needs a little bit more room. Likewise, the caps lock key is actually 1.75U. Let's just make sure we select this, 1.75U. And the shift key is 2.25U. And if you set up your alternate symbols correctly, this should be very easy to select and move around. So what we now need to do, and this is just the first column, let's just move all of these components a little bit, or at least the ones that we're not working with right now. Just a little bit. Maybe, yeah, we can move them away. We can always move them back if we need to. Okay, so let's turn our grid back on, turn our snapping back on. And I think I said that this component needed to be at 500, 500. So let's just go ahead and select it, turn our grid point snapping back on, and let's set this to 125, 125. I think that's the grid that I ended up using in the previous design, but we might still need to adjust it for some of these, for example, 2.25U components and so on. But let's go ahead and place this at 500, 500, which I believe is right there. Go to properties, we can see that the X and Y location is now 500, 500. And then all of these other switches, using this assembly outline that I have drawn, need to line up exactly with it. So we can see that vertically it lines up, but horizontally, we're gonna have to move it over just slightly. Same thing with this one. Same thing with this one probably. These switches, however, should be just okay. So This one in the top left, this is our escape key. And then this one here is our tilde, or the squiggly line. So just like that, these line up very nicely. Now let's just adjust our grid. If I remember correctly, what grid size do we want? Let's try 62.5 in the X. 62. Numlock on 62.5. Oh, a little smaller. 31.25. There we go. So if we use the 31.25 grid, this should all line up nicely with each other. So if you look at your keyboard on your computer, right, tab, caps lock, shift, these are all just a little wider, but they are all technically part of that same column. So now let's go back to the placement command and use the series option. Now we want to place so next to the escape key is the number 1, which is going to go right there. Or excuse me, that's F1. And then the number 1 is going to go below it right here. No. And then I might actually have a little space between the function keys and my number keys. I'm not exactly sure how big of space I want to use it, but we're just going to assume it's about, I think in this case, it's a 1/4 of an inch. So what I'm going to do now is actually place all of these keys around where I think they should go. I might make a little notes here and there, but most of this section of the video is going to be sped up just so you guys don't have to sit here watching me explain every little key and where it has to go exactly. So yeah, go ahead and enjoy that part of the video. We'll speed through it. All right, guys, so the next key that I have to place here is actually that spacebar, which we talked about earlier. This is switch 100. And again, I'm just kind of placing it roughly at first. And then in the properties, we're going to switch it to this 6.25U. And just make sure again that you use the assembly outline in each of these symbols as a guide of where it needs to be placed. One other thing that I recommend is if you look on your keyboard, the number 3 will quickly toggle to your 3D view. So I can then quickly see, if I have any issues with the placement. Looks like everything is, lining up really nicely right now. And then I can use the number 1 and the number 2 to flip between the top and the bottom. And then again, just click the number 3 on your keyboard to toggle back to the 2D view for the rest of your placement. So I'm just going to keep on going here and let's speed the video back up. All right, so at this point in the design, we've pretty much placed all of the function keys here at the top. The next key in this, row here is we have the print screen key and the delete key. And then we're pretty much done with this row. And below it, what we have is the backspace key, which should be fairly wide. And in this case, it's actually 2U. So if we lined up everything correctly, the rest of these keys around this section here should pretty much cut us off right around here. So we might need to make some small adjustments to switch 130, which is actually the left key. And then we also have an up key, a down key, and a right key. So I don't know exactly where the arrow keys will go, but right around this section, 130, 136, 135, and 148. These are your up, down, left, right arrow keys. So we'll kind of see exactly where we need to put that. So this is the backslash. This is a 1.5U. And then what else do we have here? Looks like that is it for this column. So the enter key, that's this one, right? No? Which is the enter key? 134, this one. This is our enter key. This one needs to be a 2U. So let's just move that. And these should be lining up, so possibly we set one of the sizes incorrectly. We'll get, oh, excuse me, this is actually 2.25U. There we go. So now if we move this, perfect. So it lines up. And then the right shift, which is this key here, 129, that one is 1.75U. So presumably it fits somewhere here. 1.75U. Perfect, just like that. And then 135, this should be the up on our arrow keys. My guess is it's going to go somewhere here. 129 is right shift, should be 1.75. So let's take a look at that. So it's 1.75. I'm wondering if maybe I set that incorrectly. So I'm expecting these to more or less line up. Let's just double check to see if any of the other keys here in this row are of a different size. So this one is a 2.25, and then I more or less would expect it to be symmetrical. So if we set this one to 2.25, not a perfect fit. So let's see if anything else on this row here needs to be of a different size. Nope, so everything should be 1U. Let me just select all of these switches, make sure that they're all where they need to be. Okay, those are correct. And then go to page 2. These are correct as well. So 129 right shift. Let's see if 2.75U fits how we need it to. Yeah, looks like maybe I just mistyped it on the schematic, so we'll just go ahead and fix that. This should be 2.75U. And it's a nice large shift button. And then this is our, let's see, our Alt, our Control, and then the arrow keys. So we'll adjust that in a second. Next, we want to make sure that we can fit our numpad. And this is a delete key. Yep, that's correct. Okay, so next we have our home key, which should be somewhere here. All right, so I think I remember what my intention was here. So if we set this shift key back to, well, what did I say, 1.75U, and place it here, and we also adjust the sizes of these switches to, and again, all of these switches have the alt symbols, so realistically, you can customize your keyboard to however you prefer it to look. So if I change these back to 1U and move them over, this should give me a little bit more room to play with, such that the up fits right here, left fits right here, down, and 148, which is right. And there we have the typical kind of triangle pattern for our up, down, left, right arrow keys. So maybe this, instead of a 1, is a 1.25. And this is, let's see, 1.25 and 1.5U. There we go. So in this case, we'll have a slightly larger control than the Alt key, but if I switch to my 3D view here, seems to look just fine to me. Again, you can play around with this, see what works for you, but what this allows us to do is then fit all of these keys right above the right arrow key, just like that. And then if you want to have some space, for example, between the function keys and, let's see, 137, this is print screen and delete. So we have escape, F1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then we have print screen and delete, or maybe this goes here, right? Customize it as you see fit. And then now we just have to fit these numpad keys. So let's go ahead and do that really quick. All right, and finally the enter key, which is this 171, and the num plus, so the numpad plus key, these are vertical 2U size. So I have a 2U vert here, move that down, and then this one is also 2U vert, 2U vert, move that down. And then, we have a little bit of extra space here on the right. I want to more or less have about the same spacing as here on the left side. So we can move all of these numpad keys together to around right there, such that if I look at this key, it should be right at around 15 inches. So it's from here to here is, half an inch. So from here to the center of this, well, it's going to go to the outside, but yeah. If I click on the center origin of this component, it's at 15 inches, while this line is at 15.5. So we have that half an inch. We also have a small separation between our regular keyboard and the numpad, which if you look at a sort of standard keyboard that has a numpad or a large size keyboard, there is usually a bit of separation there. So going back into my 3D view, look at that, looks good. Again, customize it as you see fit. Maybe you want, all of these to be shifted a little to the right. Maybe you want the delete key to be larger. Whatever it is, treat this as your design. Customize it as you see fit. All right. So to place the diodes above all these components, what I'm going to do is change my grid back to 125. And what this should do is place a grid point essentially at the center top point of each of these keys. So if I go to my switch 159, which is the top left in my matrix, and I look at diode 141, and I place it right at this point. Oh, not right there. Grab it by the center, and I want to place it right there. Let's just turn off our snapping and make sure that we're only looking at the component center and origin for now. Instead, well, we can keep some of these on, but we just want to make sure that we're not grabbing it by the pin. So now the snapping should only go to, you see, the center of the component. We're going to be placing on this grid point, which is again centered with the origin of each key and at the top of each of the sort of U assembly bounding boxes. And if I go into my 3D view, flip this here, you can see that there's plenty of room for it, even though it's technically overlapping with, the assembly bounding box of another component. Again, plenty of room, so we'd be able to place these and place the switches without any issue. So what I'll do is I will go through each of these diodes and simply use the series placement and the connection indicator to show where it needs to be connected. So again, we will speed through this part of the video. All right, so we're all done with placing all of those diodes. I think maybe I messed up once or twice. Yep, so I see here one of these diodes. Simply just move it where it needs to go. And I believe there was one somewhere around here as well. Even if we don't find it now, once we start doing the layout, there it is. Once you start doing the actual layout, if you find it, you can always move it. It's not like once you're done with placement, that's exactly where that component has to be placed. Plenty of leeway there. Usually what I like to do at this point, especially with a board like this where, I have some very convoluted kind of placement and I have these rows and columns, which I want to make sure are easy to route, might be a good idea to turn on your connections. And the reason I do this is I like to see, okay, all of my columns are more or less lined up so that when I'm connecting these, it won't be very difficult to do so, right? I won't be having to cross and place a ton of vias. I can see here that each of these rows just connects right across and doesn't zigzag between different rows. So we're, I think, in really good shape with all of these keys. The next thing we want to do is just to place all of these LEDs here. Now, my initial thought was that these LEDs would be somewhere at the top here and essentially line up with each of the columns which we have in our matrix. It's not super fancy, but I think it's kind of cool. So let's just go ahead and do that. And let me double check my LEDs. I believe they're just labeled LED 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 17. So more or less in numerical order. Again, using the placement command, I'll just select LED 2 through LED 17, and I will line them up with each of these columns here. 5, 6, 7. And again, because we're using a grid which is kind of symmetrical with our components and this U dimensioning that the keycaps like to, or excuse me, that the keyboard likes to use, that just makes it that much easier to place all these components. And yeah, so now here I can see that, this mounting hole will not work in this location. Maybe we move it somewhere over here. So there we go, place that diode there. And then we have all of these capacitors, which are bypassing the power net. So let's go and place each of these. I believe these are just 19, 20, 21. Yep, so should be able to place them right next to each of these here. Let's set our grid to 62.5. Yeah, just so we can kind of place it like that. And I'm using the R key on my keyboard as a hotkey to rotate these, and each of them will be placed like so. Okay, there we go. So all of those LEDs are now placed. In 3D view, it looks something like this. And realistically, maybe I'll have like a diffuse bar over the top of this, or maybe not. Maybe we'll just keep it as is. But these are placed pretty much exactly how I want them to be. Well, maybe these didn't rotate. Let's try that again. There we go. There we go. Okay. So now I got these all rotated. Should be in good shape. And all we have left now is really just the LCD and all of the accompanying parts underneath it. So we're almost done with our placement, almost ready to start routing. Let's go ahead and hide all of our connections again. For this, I can actually go ahead and turn off the grid now. Let's just line up this LCD more or less with, I'm gonna go to a finer grid here, more or less with this key. So right around here, I'm happy with. You can play around with this, and I imagine that even in my first version of this board, it might not be exactly where I want it to be. Once I start making the enclosure for this, maybe I need it to be, a little higher, a little lower, whatever it is. Right now, this is our first revision of the board. So let's just keep it as is. I'm going to go ahead and turn off this quick view and maybe just turn on my assembly layers. And we want some copper as well. There we go. Okay, so I'll use my schematic as a reference. If I look at the power page, I know that I want to move my USB connector to somewhere over here. And I'm okay with causing a DRC, right? So we'll get a DRC on this top layer that's going to say, package to place keep-in spacing. This is slightly outside of the keep-in. But if I go into my 3D view, I do want my USB to be slightly sticking outside of the board, just so that it is easy to plug into. Not a problem. Let's go ahead and move this guy out of the way. And then we have the power page. We have the CC1 and CC2 resistor. I believe it's these two. So these need to go somewhere around where our USB is. I want this one on this side and this one on this side. Here we go. And we also have on our power page the main regulator. Let's move this guy somewhere over here. And it has two capacitors. One on the input to the regulator and one on the output to the regulator. Seems like a good location. We also have, this is the I2C IO extender. It'll go somewhere around here. J1, which is our shorting terminal. This is what we want to short in order to set the programming for our device. So we'll place it right around here. Let's get all of these components out of the way for a second. Talk about where we want to place those. First things first is This is a flash memory. Let's keep that over there right now. First things first is that I want to talk about this main controller. Usually when placing this, I like to kind of keep in mind where all the components are going to be connecting. So if I look at kind of on the left side of my controller, I can see that all of the different columns need to connect to somewhere there. And in the top left section, that connects to my flash. And then each of these rows here, these are connecting to the bottom right side of my controller. So as I rotate it, I can kind of get an idea of, what is the best orientation for it. But worst case, if I need to make adjustments in the future, it's not a big deal. But I actually think that this orientation will work out just fine. So we'll keep it to where pin 1 is here in the top left corner. The flash memory, I actually think this is a pretty good location for it. This is our crystal, so somewhere around here is probably fine. And then let's just go ahead and select these two load capacitors, place them right around our crystal. And you don't have to be perfect with placement. I feel like I keep repeating myself with this, but really you don't have to be perfect with this placement, because once you start routing, sometimes you'll notice that you don't have enough room and you might have to make some adjustments anyway. So maybe this needs to be a little further. That's okay at this stage. There's a resistor in series, so we can go ahead and move that as well. Maybe to somewhere here. And then let's see what else we have. So we can work on all of the decoupling capacitors. So before the decoupling capacitors, let's just place this potentiometer somewhere underneath the LCD. We can use the 3D view just to make sure that's in the right direction. Yeah, so it looks like it's actually backwards. So let's rotate it. And if we go back to the 3D view, yep. So it's just a little key, a little Phillips screw hole. So we can have a hole in our enclosure, for example, and then someone can put a little screwdriver in and then adjust the LCD contrast to make it, easier to see the characters on this LCD. Not a problem. All right, so I believe all we have left now is whatever this guy is here. This is the logic converter for our LEDs. We can place that, let's say somewhere around here. Perfect. I have an itchy nose today. Not sure why. M2, this is for the, what is this for? This is for the backlight. So we can place this somewhere next to the screen. Here is fine. All right, so now let's place all of our decoupling capacitors. For placing decoupling capacitors, what I like to do is actually go by each of the power nets and change the color just for the purpose of placement. So for our 1.1 volt net, let's assign a color of teal. For our 3.3 volt net, let's assign a color of yellow. And our 5 volt net, which actually I don't think we have any, no decoupling capacitors here. So we don't have to assign any color to that. And then let's go to our controller page. And if you remember, we had some notes on that controller page. So for example, it says place this one microfarad capacitor close to pin 45. So we'll just make sure we place it close to pin 45, which is 43, 45, this one right here. So it needs to be somewhere around here. Perfect. And then it says place the other 1 microfarad capacitor close to pin 44, which is this one right here. And it needs to be close to pin 44. Just like that. And then we can more or less place the, let's see if there's any other notes that I have here. So these two resistors, which are the damping resistors for our USB, these need to be placed close to the Raspberry Pi, the RPi 2040. So we'll place those nearby. There we go. And we do actually need to rotate these. So we do have some package-to-package spacing. Not to worry. We can always make adjustments. If we look at our, I'm guessing this is our DFA bound. No, place bound. Here we go. There's a little bit of overlap. So just make a slight adjustment, move them out of the way, make sure that they're not overlapping, and you're good to go. All right, let's see. Decoupling capacitors. Okay, C1, C2, that's these guys here. These need to be decoupling these nuts. Place it as close as you can. We're going to be only using the top layer for the placement because it's much, much easier to do assembly that way. But realistically, if it's a little hard to find space, don't worry if it's a little far from the pins. You know, these modern microcontrollers are very tolerant to, well, not very, but much more tolerant to noise than they used to be. So, you know, this is already pretty close. If we need to move it out just a little bit, you know, because we're going to need to do quite a bit of routing here, dropping vias. You know, give yourself a little bit of room. Yeah, likewise, these I can already see we're probably going to have to move out a little bit. Okay. And then the rest of these capacitors we can move as well. So these just need to go on these different yellow nets that I have marked here. So one here, one here. Actually, this one was already almost in the exact location where it needs to be. One here. And last but not least, somewhere around here. Perfect. All right, and then, oh, two more. So these guys, let's see, where are we missing decoupling capacitors? So one should be here. And it looks like one needs to be just to the left of these guys. There we go. And then we have, let's see, these are the pull-ups for our I2C. We can either place them by this component, which, you know, has the STA, SCL connections, or we can place them next to the microcontroller. Either one works. For now, let's try close to the microcontroller. And this one here. Again, we're going to need to give ourselves a little more room. And we are good to go. 5 components left. Okay, so this one here, if I look at my schematic, what is this component? R4. R4 is... Show me R4 on the schematic. Oh, there we go. Just had to scroll over a little bit. So this is the pull-up on our chip select. Somewhere around here should work. We have the pull down, optional, also going to the chip select, so we can just place it right next to it. And yeah, I can move this out of the way, not a problem. Or, you know, maybe even place this just like that. Next we have, this is the decoupling capacitor for our flash memory. That looks good. This is the decoupling capacitor for our I/O expander. somewhere around here should be fine. And this looks like the pull down on the gate to our MOSFET, which is controlling the backlight for our LCD. So there we go. We are pretty much done with the placement. You know, while we're working on the layout, we might make small adjustments here or there. I know this has been a very long video, but realistically, there are no shortcuts to placement, right? You have to kind of go through and, you know, place each component one by one, maybe in small groups if you have some smart groupings in your schematic. But don't be afraid to try something new with your placement as well. If it doesn't work out, you can always make adjustments. Let's go ahead and save this and look at my finished placement, it should look more or less the same, and it really does. I can see that I have actually, you know, mounting hole here, one in the corner, one here, and one here. Again, about the same. And these components are placed right around exactly the same where I did in my previous attempt. So if you guys want to continue with this version of the placement, please feel free to download the BRD. It's called the OrCAD Keyboard Video Series 4 placementdone.brd. Or if you've done your own placement, feel free to continue with that as well. That is it for this video. It's been quite a long one, but hope you guys enjoyed it. And I hope if you've done your own placement on your own board that you are happy with it. In the next video, we are going to continue with getting ready for finally working on the layout for our design, which means we need to set up some constraints for our board. Yeah, thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to leave a comment below. I will see you in the next video.